Story 1: The Vanishing Camper Outline. 1. Weekend hike into the unknown. Four friends, Liam, Emma, Jason and Sarah, decided to escape the city for a weekend camping trip into the remote Cascades forest. The journey started with laughter, music, and excitement. But as they drove deeper into the mountains, an uneasy quiet began to settle. Towering pine trees blocked much of the fading sunlight, casting long, twisting shadows over the dirt trail. The air smelled sharp and earthy, carrying the faint tang of moss and decaying leaves. Birds were fewer here, and the occasional rustle of small animals felt amplified, echoing in ways that made the group tense. Upon reaching a hidden clearing, they noticed signs of prior visitors, broken tents, cold fire pits, and scattered remnants of supplies. Emma knelt to examine footprints, only to notice how elongated and irregular they appeared, as if belonging to something not entirely human. Jason laughed nervously, claiming pranksters must have left them, but the others felt the hair on their necks rise. The shadows between trees seemed to shift when unobserved, lengthening unnaturally and twisting in impossible angles. Nightfall arrived faster than anticipated. The group set up a fire, providing a small circle of safety. Outside the firelight, darkness pressed heavily, suffocating and thick. The wind carried whispers that were just beyond comprehension, faint but unmistakable, threading through the trees. Emma shivered, glancing at the surrounding forest with growing apprehension. Liam reassured her, trying to rationalize the noises as the natural sounds of nocturnal wildlife, but the sense of being watched remained. Even mundane movements, the sway of branches, the creak of the ground, felt deliberate. Every step made on the underbrush seemed to be mirrored by a presence just out of view. The friends felt an unshakable sense of isolation, of being intruders in a forest that had its own awareness. By midnight, the air itself seemed alive, and every whisper, snap and rustle intensified the feeling that something unseen stalked them. The weekend adventure had begun as fun, but already fear had rooted itself firmly in their hearts, a quiet, patient dread that refused to be ignored. Outline 2. Disappearance and panic. Jason volunteered to fetch water from a stream slightly down the trail. Minutes passed, then half an hour, with no sign of him returning. Panic quickly replaced the initial worry as the other three called out into the dense forest. Their voices echoed, swallowed by the towering trees. When they finally located the stream, Jason's footprints led to the water's edge, and then stopped abruptly, as though he had been swallowed by the earth itself. The friends tried to follow, moving deeper into the forest, but the landscape seemed to change around them. Familiar trees appeared in unfamiliar places, and paths they thought they knew twisted into loops. Emma caught glimpses of movement, a shadow flitting between trunks, always vanishing when looked at directly. Liam's rational explanations faltered with each passing moment, replaced by the rising terror of something unnatural manipulating their surroundings. The whispers intensified. Sometimes they sounded like Jason's voice, other times they formed words they couldn't comprehend, echoing inside their heads rather than through the trees. The forest itself seemed alive, aware, patient, and intelligent. Huddled near the fire, Sarah found Jason's discarded backpack and notebook. The pages were filled with frantic writing. "It watches, waits, do not look, do not move." The message was clear. Jason had encountered whatever haunted the forest and left a desperate warning behind. With exhaustion and fear gnawing at them, the remaining friends realized they were in no position to think rationally. Each rustle, snap, and whisper heightened their paranoia. Shadows appeared where no light could reach, and every attempt to retrace their steps led to confusion. The forest's dark intent became undeniable. They were prey in a living, sentient wilderness, and Jason had already become part of its mysterious collection. Outline 3. Encounter with the shadow. A shape emerged between the trees, a tall humanoid figure that seemed to absorb all light around it. Its presence was suffocating, oppressive, and unexplainably patient. Liam froze, his instincts screaming to flee, yet the forest itself seemed to trap them. The entity never moved toward them directly, but remained always at the edge of vision, watching, waiting. Liam grabbed Emma and bolted, branches tearing at their clothes, thorns scratching their skin. Despite their frantic flight, the shadow remained uncatchable, always looming in their peripheral vision. The whispers formed coherent sentences now, cruel and deliberate. You cannot leave. You cannot hide. Each word resonated inside their minds, not through sound, making them aware that this being did not abide by physical rules. Sarah stumbled over exposed roots, collapsing to the forest floor. Looking up, the shadow stood directly above her, impossibly still. Its dark, featureless form radiated intelligence and malice. The surrounding trees groaned and whispered, their movements synchronizing with the entity's attention. The friends ran blindly, their minds flooded with a mixture of panic and disbelief. Every attempt to escape brought them deeper into a labyrinthine forest that seemed to warp at will. Branches clawed at faces, and the cold night air pressed into every exposed skin. Each heartbeat echoed like a drum of doom. The friends' rationality disintegrated, replaced by pure survival instinct. The forest and the shadow were one, orchestrating a chase with terrifying patience. Even as exhaustion set in, they couldn't stop. The entity waited, knowing their terror was the forest's fuel. Outline 4. Escape and lingering horror. At dawn, a pale grey light filtered through the trees. The friends stumbled upon the trail back to their parked car. Mud, scratches and tears streaked their clothes and faces. Relief washed over them, but fear lingered. Jason was gone, vanished without trace, leaving behind only his frantic warning. In the notebook, they reported the disappearance, but authorities found nothing. Search parties discovered no footprints, no clothing, no disturbance in the forest. Local legends whispered of areas where people simply vanished, taken by the forest, if curiosity led them too far. Weeks later, Liam received a text from an unknown number. "We are still here waiting." A chill ran down his spine. Even in city streets, every dense forest or wooded area seemed impossibly alive. Shadows moved unnaturally. Whispers threaded into the wind. Though they had survived, the forest had left its mark on their psyches. The memory of Jason, the black shadow, and the feeling of unblinking eyes lingered. They had escaped physically, but the unseen presence had etched itself into their minds. Every night, whispers haunted dreams, and the sensation of being watched persisted. The forest's darkness was no longer confined to the trees. It followed them, patient and eternal, waiting for the next lapse in vigilance. Story 2. The Attic Watcher Outline. 1. Moving into the Victorian house. The Mitchell family, David, Laura, and their children, Amelia and Max, had just moved into an old Victorian home at the edge of town. Its grand facade and towering chimneys spoke of history and elegance, but a heavy stillness permeated the interior. Every step on the polished wooden floors echoed in an almost unnatural way, the silence magnifying minor creaks and groans of the settling structure. Amelia, the youngest, was fascinated by the attic. Dusty beams crisscrossed above her head, and the faint scent of old pine and mold clung to the air, mingling with the mustiness of the room. It felt like a secret sanctuary waiting to be explored. First, the minor oddities were easy to dismiss. Chairs sometimes shifted positions, and doors that had been closed were later found slightly ajar. Emma laughed nervously, claiming it was probably the wind. But Max noticed shadows moving where no light could reach, and sometimes he swore he saw fleeting glimpses of a tall figure at the edge of vision. Laura brushed off their concerns, chalking them up to overactive imaginations. Yet, the sensation of being observed, heavy and uncomfortable, clung to every room in the house. The attic in particular seemed alive. It exuded an oppressive presence, one that didn't need to move to be felt. The floorboards creaked under invisible weight, and drafts seemed to follow Amelia specifically. At night, the sounds intensified. Whispers, soft taps, and faint shuffling that couldn't be attributed to any human or animal. The family, initially enchanted by the home's history and charm, began sensing that the attic held secrets far older and far darker than they could imagine. Even routine activities carried tension. Cooking in the kitchen or reading in the living room, every glance toward the attic staircase brought a prickling unease. Amelia often found herself staring at the shadows in the corners, wondering if someone or something was always watching. It wasn't just a room, it was a presence, patient and observant, waiting for the right moment to reveal its intentions. The house, in all its grandeur, had become a character itself, with the attic as its dark heart, pulsing silently above. The unsuspecting family. Outline 2. Strange occurrences. Nightfall brought the first real terror. As the Mitchells tried to settle into their nightly routines, faint sounds began to echo through the hallways. Soft whispers, almost melodic, floated from the attic, growing in intensity as darkness thickened. Objects in Amelia's room moved. Without explanation, her favorite book slid off the desk, and small toys appeared rearranged in patterns she didn't recognize. Max reported seeing a shadow near the attic door, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes. By the time David came to check, the figure vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence of the old house. Doors that had been securely latched were now slightly open. The creaks of floorboards sounded deliberate, synchronized, almost as if someone was pacing in anticipation. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, and the scent of old pine mixed with an acrid undertone of decay. Laura tried to rationalize the events, insisting that old houses make noises and that their minds were playing tricks. But every member of the family experienced the same mounting dread. Even during the day, shadows clung unnaturally to corners, bending the perception of the room in subtle, disturbing ways. Amelia began speaking of whispers that called her name, urging her to enter the attic. When the family tried to keep her away, she resisted, insisting someone was waiting for her there. Her descriptions of the figure were vivid, tall, skeletal, pale-faced, unblinking, and she insisted it only appeared when she was alone. David and Laura dismissed it as a child's imagination, but as the occurrences escalated, logic began to falter. Mirrors reflected shapes that were not there, and the stairs to the attic groaned under non-existent footsteps. The oppressive atmosphere seeped into their daily lives. Sleep became fragmented, as if the house itself refused to grant rest. Even mundane movements, pouring water, walking to the kitchen, felt scrutinized by unseen eyes. Shadows moved in patterns inconsistent with natural light. Every corner of the home seemed alive, watching, anticipating. The Mitchells began to realize that the presence was not merely haunting the attic, it was present throughout the house, intelligent, patient, and malevolent. Fear settled permanently, embedding itself into the very walls they had once admired. Outline 3. Unearthing the house's history. Determined to understand the escalating horror, David began exploring the attic thoroughly. Among dusty trunks, old furniture, and yellowed newspapers, he discovered photographs and documents chronicling previous occupants. In several photographs, a gaunt figure appeared, always in the background, almost invisible, but unmistakably there. The same figure Amelia had described, the attic watcher, had haunted the house for generations. Further examination revealed journals from past residents. The entries detailed unexplainable occurrences, shadows moving independently, whispers in the night, and objects relocating with intent. One journal contained an ominous warning: "The watcher sees you always. To acknowledge him is to invite his presence. Never linger in the attic." The handwriting was erratic, trembling with fear, a testament to the terror endured by those before them. The house's architecture seemed designed to amplify its presence. High ceilings, narrow staircases, and long hallways created echoes that made ordinary noises sound deliberate, each creak and groan amplifying the watcher's perceived power. Objects were arranged in ways that made even mundane movement disorienting. The Mitchells realized the attic's dark force had existed for decades, patiently observing each generation, gaining strength from fear and curiosity alike. Amelia's fascination became a terrifying conduit. The figure seemed drawn to her, appearing more frequently, lingering longer, and communicating through whispers and subtle gestures. Shadows coalesced around her at night, beckoning, testing boundaries. The family attempted to document the activity, but cameras malfunctioned, and recordings revealed only static. The house was alive in a way no human could comprehend. David, Laura, and Max understood that rationality offered no protection. Their home, once a dream, had become a cage. The Watchers' intelligence surpassed anything natural. They were being observed, studied, and psychologically preyed upon. Each passing night strengthened the figure's presence, eroding their resolve and sanity. Outline 4. Confrontation and escape. A violent storm erupted one night, rattling windows and shaking the foundations of the house. Amelia screamed from the attic and the family raced upstairs. The figure stood at the center of the room, impossibly still, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Doors slammed violently, objects flew across rooms, and the floorboards creaked under unseen weight. The storm outside seemed to echo the malevolent energy within, amplifying the terror. Laura grabbed Amelia as David frantically searched for an exit. The figure's presence grew denser, almost tangible, pressing upon them with suffocating intent. Max tried to distract it, yelling and waving his arms, but the entity seemed unaffected, its attention unyielding. The family realized confrontation was impossible. The only chance was escape. David managed to pry open a side window and won. By one, they climbed into the rain-soaked yard, hearts hammering, lungs burning from terror. Even after reaching the street, the house radiated unease. Whispers followed them faintly in the wind, and shadows seemed to stretch toward them in their peripheral vision. Authorities found no evidence of the figure or any disturbance within the home. Photographs taken previously revealed nothing. The Watcher remained invisible to all but those directly observed. Weeks later, Amelia awoke in the middle of the night to a soft whisper calling her name. The family had moved temporarily, yet the attic Watcher's presence had embedded itself in her psyche. Nightmares replayed each encounter with chilling clarity. The house, though distant, had left a permanent mark. Every Victorian home, every old building, carried echoes of its malevolent sentinel. The Mitchells had survived physically, but not mentally. The Watcher endured, patient and eternal, lurking in shadows, waiting for the next curious soul to enter its domain. Story 3. The Hollow Neighbor Outline. 1. Moving into a quiet apartment, Jared had finally found a top-floor apartment in an aging building at the outskirts of the city. The location promised solitude, peace, and escape from his stressful work life. Upon arrival, the hallways smelled faintly of mildew, a stale, damp odor that clung stubbornly to the carpeted floors. His apartment itself was quaint but functional, featuring a small balcony overlooking the street and high ceilings that amplified every sound. Everything seemed ordinary at first, yet unease began to creep in almost immediately. Across from Jared's door lived an elderly neighbor who was rarely seen. From brief glimpses, Jared noticed the man's hollow eyes, gaunt features, and an unsettling stillness. He moved with precision, never speaking, yet his presence seemed to loom, almost tangible. At first, Jared chalked it up to eccentricity, yet every time he returned from work, the same unnerving sensation followed. The neighbor standing silently across the hall, staring. Even with closed doors, Jared felt an invisible gaze tracking his movements. Footsteps echoed in the empty corridors. At night, objects occasionally moved from their original positions. Doors that were securely locked appeared slightly open. Jared began noticing subtle shifts, shadows flickering where they shouldn't, reflections in polished surfaces revealing movement that wasn't there. The building, though familiar, began to feel labyrinthine. Halls seemed to stretch unexpectedly. Angles appeared warped. Each day brought a growing sense of paranoia, an underlying fear that the apartment was more than it appeared. Even mundane activities felt surveilled. Showering, cooking, or reading became exercises in hyper-awareness. He felt observed constantly, though there was no sign of intrusion. His sleep became fragmented, haunted by whispers at the edges of consciousness. The neighbor's presence seemed to exert influence over the entire building, amplifying every sound, every shadow, every eerie perception. Jared's excitement for solitude had transformed into a creeping dread. Something was deeply, unnervingly wrong, and it centered on the hollow, unblinking eyes across the hallway. Outline 2. Unnatural activity. By the second week, the apartment itself seemed to participate in the horror. At night, Jared heard scraping and soft footsteps along the hallway outside his door, often pausing just beyond the threshold. Sometimes the footsteps synchronized with his own movements, echoing him with eerie precision. Objects inside his apartment moved inexplicably. Pens slid across the desk, cups tipped over without cause, and photographs rotated to face different directions. The neighbor rarely left his apartment, yet the disturbances were unmistakable. One evening, Jared peeked through his peephole and saw the neighbor standing motionless, staring directly at him. Hours passed, but the figure didn't move, its hollow gaze fixed, unblinking. Jared tried stepping outside, only to find hallways distorted. Familiar exits led him back toward the same doors. Even the stairwell seemed to twist unnaturally. Fear gnawed at him. Every attempt to rationalize the events failed. Logic had no place here. Whispers intensified, sometimes sounding like Jared's own voice, repeating thoughts he hadn't yet spoken. Other times, phrases formed in languages he didn't know, resonating within his skull rather than through his ears. Sleep became impossible. The apartment, once a sanctuary, felt like a trap. Light sources flickered unpredictably. Shadows coalesced in corners, watching silently. The neighbor's presence permeated every space, invisible yet omnipresent. Each day, Jared felt more isolated. Attempts to speak to other tenants revealed no one else had noticed anything unusual. Authorities dismissed his reports as overreaction. Every night, the whispers grew louder. Objects moved more aggressively, and the shadowed corners seemed to pulse with awareness. Fear had become tangible. He understood that something unnatural, intelligent, and malevolent existed inside the building. The hollow neighbor wasn't just a person, he was a vessel for something far darker, manipulating the very fabric of reality around Jared. Outline 3. Discovery of the horror. A cryptic note slid under Jared's door one night. Come see what I keep inside. Driven by a mix of fear and irresistible curiosity, he followed the message to the neighbor's apartment. The door opened silently, as though it expected him. Inside, the smell of decay was immediate, thick and clinging to his clothes. Dust-coated furniture lined the rooms. Old photographs of tenants decorated the walls, each face hollow-eyed, expressions frozen in terror, as if the room itself had absorbed their fear. At the far end of the apartment, Jared found a small, dimly lit room. Rows of jars filled with preserved human eyes lined the shelves, their glass surfaces catching the dim light. Each jar reflected faint shadows, as though they contained more than just eyes. They held lingering echoes of life, of terror. The neighbor emerged from darkness, taller than before, unnaturally thin, with hollow sockets radiating malice. His lips moved silently, whispering words that resonated directly inside Jared's mind. I like to keep them looking. Panic surged. Jared stumbled backward, tripping over a rug and crashing into a wall. The apartment responded violently. Doors slammed shut on their own. Shadows stretched and twisted, closing in from every direction. The neighbor remained calm, composed, a puppet master orchestrating fear. Jared realized escape wasn't guaranteed. The entity controlling the neighbor had transformed the building into an inescapable cage. Frantically, he looked for exits. The windows refused to open fully, and hallways seemed to elongate. Every movement brought new dangers, shadows that followed, whispers that mocked, objects that tripped him at every turn. Rational thought dissolved into survival instinct. Fear dominated, every heartbeat pounding like a drum announcing doom. The hollow neighbor was not alone. Whatever animated him had full control of the building. Jared understood the terrifying truth. He was inside something alive, malevolent, and entirely patient. Outline 4. Escape and lingering terror. Summoning courage, Jared finally forced open a small window and scrambled to the fire escape. Rain had begun, soaking him instantly, but it was better than remaining trapped. He fled down the narrow metal steps, the whispers and shadows following in perception, if not in reality. Once on the street, he didn't stop running until the building was out of sight. His chest heaved and his mind raced. replaying every horrifying detail. Authorities investigated but found no neighbor, no jars, no evidence of the horrors inside. It was as if the apartment had never existed. Yet Jared knew the truth. The hollow neighbor and the malevolent presence controlling him were real. Weeks later, back in a new apartment, he received a text. "We are still here, waiting." The shadows seemed to flinch and stretch at the edge of his vision. Whispers followed. Him in the dark. The building had imprinted itself onto his psyche. Sleep was no refuge. Dreams merged with reality, filling his nights with hollow eyes and unseen corridors. The terror of the neighbor persisted, subtle yet persistent, embedded in his perception. Fear was no longer situational. It had become an extension of his mind. The hollow neighbor had transcended physical space, leaving Jared marked, haunted, and forever aware. No distance, no new apartment, no sunlight could sever the connection. He had survived physically, but not mentally. The presence endured, patient and eternal, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the next unwary soul. Story 4. The Basement Murmurs Outline. 1. Moving into the old suburban home. The Parker family, Mark, Helen, and their teenage son Dylan, had just moved into a spacious suburban home built in the 1920s. The house had a charming exterior, with ivy climbing the brick walls and tall windows that reflected the morning sun. Inside, the old woodwork creaked underfoot, and the faint smell of dust and aging timber lingered in every room. Initially, the family was excited, but the basement, dark and cramped, quickly became a source of unease. From the moment they stepped down the narrow staircase, a cold draft enveloped them. The walls were damp, covered in peeling paint and cobwebs. Strange murmurs seemed to echo from deep within, faint yet rhythmic, like whispers of conversations that never fully formed. Dylan, drawn by morbid curiosity, explored corners where shadows clung stubbornly. Every sound he made appeared to be mirrored, a soft step, a breath, a scraping of fingers along concrete, all amplified, distorted, almost purposeful. Mark tried to rationalize the discomfort as natural for an old house, yet even daytime brought unease. Moving furniture into the basement revealed scratches on the floor and walls that hadn't been noticed before. Occasionally, objects would shift slightly, as though repositioned by unseen hands. Helen felt an oppressive weight in the room, a presence that seemed to press on her shoulders. Lights flickered without reason, and the faint hum of electrical wiring occasionally merged with the whispering, creating a dissonant soundscape. As days passed, the murmurs grew more coherent. Sometimes they sounded like their own voices, repeating private thoughts or conversations that had taken place only within the house. The family felt observed constantly, even when the basement was empty. The house's dark corners began to dominate their awareness, and their nightly routines became tense exercises in avoidance. The basement, they realized, was not merely a storage area. It was the epicenter of something alive, patient, and malevolent, quietly studying its new inhabitants. Outline 2. First signs of haunting 1. Evening, while organizing boxes in the basement, Dylan noticed faint movement in the shadows. At first, it seemed like tricks of the dim lighting, but the movement became deliberate, slow, methodical, almost intelligent. The whispers grew louder, sometimes forming words. Leave. Go. You are not welcome. The family experienced cold spots, sudden drafts, and objects being misplaced. Chairs tipped over, boxes fell, and strange scratches appeared on the concrete floor. Mark attempted to investigate, shining a flashlight into corners. The beam illuminated nothing, yet the sensation of being watched intensified. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, aligning with the whispers in a synchronized pattern. The family tried ignoring the sounds, hoping it was mere imagination, but even mundane tasks triggered the murmurs. Running water, doors closing, footsteps, all became amplified, distorted, and unnervingly deliberate. One night, Dylan awoke to a low moaning from the basement. He crept down the stairs and saw vague shapes shifting in the darkness. The whispering escalated to chants, indecipherable yet terrifyingly rhythmic. Objects rolled or floated briefly before settling again. It was clear. The basement was alive, feeding off fear, patience, and the family's growing paranoia. Helen reported hearing voices mimicking her own, repeating private thoughts aloud in a distorted tone. Mark felt hands graze his shoulder when no one was near. Each manifestation was subtle yet intentional, designed to fray nerves and heighten anxiety. Sleep became near impossible, with nightmares mirroring basement events. The family realized their home had an intelligence far beyond natural phenomena, one that studied, mocked, and manipulated its occupants relentlessly. Outline 3. Escalation and confrontation. As the days progressed, the haunting intensified. Dylan awoke to find shadows forming humanoid shapes that mirrored his movements. The whispers transformed into low growls and fragmented sentences. "You cannot escape. You belong." Objects in the basement moved with precision, stacking themselves or arranging in threatening formations. The family's fear escalated, each corner of the basement representing potential danger. Mark attempted to record the events, but cameras malfunctioned and electronic devices flickered or failed entirely. The basement's darkness seemed impenetrable, absorbing light and energy. As night fell, the whispers became omnipresent, seeping into rooms above. The family began to hear murmurs even while eating or watching television, sounds that were impossible to attribute to natural sources. Determined to confront the entity, Mark descended into the basement with a flashlight and a hammer. Dylan followed hesitantly, while Helen waited at the stairs, trembling. The air thickened, carrying whispers that spoke directly into their minds, mocking, threatening, and predicting their actions. Shapes emerged from corners, humanoid but distorted. With elongated limbs and featureless faces, the family froze, realizing the basement had become a realm governed by its own rules, immune to conventional logic or defense. Despite the terror, Mark attempted to assert control, shouting for the entities to leave. The whispers became a cacophony, voices overlapping and layering in impossible patterns. The shadows recoiled briefly, as if startled, but regrouped instantly, advancing with renewed intensity. The basement was not just haunted, it was sentient, responding dynamically to fear and resistance. Each heartbeat echoed in the darkness, a drum signaling life to the unseen forces, tightening their grip over the family's sanity. Outline 4. Escape and lingering. Fear. One morning, after nights of torment, the family decided to vacate the house. They packed hastily, moving belongings into a rented van. Dylan glanced one last time at the basement, noting shadows that appeared frozen in anticipation. As they drove away, the whispers seemed to chase them, faint echoes traveling on the wind, promising they had not seen the last of the entity. Authorities inspected the basement, finding nothing unusual, no footprints, no displaced objects, no signs of paranormal activity. Yet the family knew the truth. The basement had marked them. Even weeks later, their dreams were haunted by shadows, whispers, and cold drafts. Dylan sometimes felt phantom touches, and Helen reported hearing soft murmurs when alone in empty rooms. Mark noticed shadows flickering in peripheral vision, especially in basements or dark corners. The experience had left an indelible mark. The family understood that the basement's presence was not confined by space. It had entered their consciousness. Fear became a constant companion, a subtle vibration at the edge of perception. Any basement, any darkened room, carried the potential for intrusion. The Parker family survived physically, but psychologically they were forever tethered to the malevolent intelligence dwelling in the shadows. It waited patiently, feeding on memory and fear, biding its time for the next lapse. In vigilance, the next curiosity that led into darkness. Story 5. The Midnight Caller. Outline 1. The first call. Rachel lived alone in a modest apartment on the 5th floor of an old downtown building. The first few nights were peaceful, quiet except for distant traffic and the occasional hum of air conditioning. One evening at exactly 12:03 a.m., her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. When she answered, only silence greeted her, punctuated by a faint, rasping breath. Thinking it was a prank, she hung up, but the sense of unease lingered. Over the next few nights, the calls continued at exactly the same time. Each call brought the same unsettling silence, occasionally broken by whispered fragments. Her name, indistinct phrases, or low hisses. Rachel began noticing small disturbances in her apartment. Objects slightly out of place, doors left ajar, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Each call seemed to herald a new, subtle alteration in her environment. Rachel's friends initially dismissed her concerns, suggesting stress or overactive imagination. But when she mentioned the exact timing, the consistency, and the escalating intrusions, unease settled in their own minds. She began documenting the calls, noting that the voice never spoke clearly, never revealed intent, yet evoked a primal terror. One night, she recorded the call. Playback revealed faint background, sounds, scraping, muffled whispers, and something moving in the apartment. Every creak, every small vibration, seemed in perfect synchronization with the caller's presence. It was no coincidence. The voice had awareness, precision, and intent. Rachel realized she was being observed, targeted, and psychologically manipulated. The calls became an obsession. Sleep became near impossible. Her routine shattered. She avoided leaving the apartment, afraid of what might follow her. The phone rang like clockwork, a sinister reminder of the unseen intruder in her life. Every shadow, every flicker of light, seemed infused with menace, heightening anticipation for the midnight call that never failed to terrify. Outline 2. Escalation of terror. Within a week, the calls became more invasive. The whispers grew slightly more articulate, uttering words like "I see you," "Don't move," and occasionally "soon." Objects in her apartment moved during the calls. Books shifted, chairs tilted, and photographs fell from shelves. Rachel noticed cold spots where the unseen caller seemed to linger, sudden drafts and faint breathing in rooms where no one else existed. The psychological effect intensified. Rachel felt herself being followed even during the day. Glances out of windows revealed fleeting shapes that vanished when observed directly. The phone calls seemed tied to these manifestations, triggering movement and shadows. Her mind struggled to differentiate between real threats and hallucinations induced by sleep deprivation and terror. Determined to reclaim control, Rachel sought help. Police suggested changing numbers or ignoring the calls, but when she attempted to block the number, it appeared to bypass restrictions, calling immediately from another line. Paranormal investigators she consulted detected inexplicable readings, electrical disturbances, sudden drops in temperature, and an unnerving energy signature concentrated around the apartment's rooms. Rachel's isolation grew. Friends avoided her increasingly desperate calls, worried about her mental state. She was trapped, each call reinforcing fear and helplessness. The entity, human or otherwise, showed patience and intelligence. It knew her habits, her fears, and leveraged them meticulously. Even ordinary sounds, like the hum of the fridge, became perceived threats, distorted by anticipation of the next midnight call. Sleep, food, and peace became secondary to vigilance. The apartment, once a safe haven, transformed into a labyrinth of fear. Every shadow, every minor noise seemed synchronized with the calls. The entity had claimed the space, not merely as a home invasion, but as a psychological prison, shaping Rachel's reality and eroding her sense of control, preparing her for what was to come. Outline 3. Direct confrontation. One night, driven by desperation, Rachel decided to confront the presence. She left her apartment door unlocked and sat in the living room with the phone in hand, ready for the midnight call. At 12:03 a.m., the familiar ring sounded. She answered, her voice trembling but firm. "Who are you? What do you want?" The line was silent for several seconds, then a deep, distorted whisper responded, "You can't escape. I'm always here." The room grew colder instantly, and shadows stretched unnaturally along walls and corners. Objects rattled as if an unseen force manipulated them. Rachel's phone emitted a low, static-filled hum, and every nerve in her body screamed danger. She demanded it stop, threatening to leave, destroy the phone, or call authorities. The whispers escalated, overlapping, chanting in multiple distorted tones simultaneously. The shadows coalesced, forming humanoid shapes that loomed over her. Rachel attempted to flee, but the apartment seemed to resist. Furniture obstructed. Exits. Hallways appeared to elongate unnaturally. The entity demonstrated precise control over her perception. It knew when she would hesitate, when fear would paralyze her, and manipulated shadows and sounds to exploit each moment. Her mind teetered on the edge of panic and dissociation. The call line, once simple and ordinary, had become a conduit for direct psychological attack, amplifying terror and blurring boundaries between reality and nightmare. Rachel realized she was confronting something not merely human, but highly intelligent and malevolent, capable of invading her private space, her mind, and her perception of reality itself. Every action was anticipated, every movement monitored, and every attempt at resistance countered. Her sense of security had been annihilated entirely. Outline 4. Escape and lingering horror. In a desperate final move, Rachel grabbed the phone and smashed it, unplugging every cord. She packed belongings into a car and drove out of the city, leaving the apartment and the building behind. Exhausted, terrified, she tried to regain normalcy. Yet even miles away, faint whispers lingered in her mind. Shadows seemed to flicker in empty rooms of the hotel she rented. The entity's reach transcended physical proximity. Authorities inspected the apartment, finding nothing unusual. Paranormal investigators reported no readings. It was as if the building itself had been a focal point for the presence, now imprinted in Rachel's psyche. Each night, sleep brought dreams of the distorted shapes, whispered threats and rhythmic calls she could not ignore. The entity had transferred from physical to mental space, ensuring its influence remained. Friends noticed her growing paranoia. Ordinary objects, a ringing phone, shadows in hallways, even reflective surfaces, triggered panic attacks. Rachel understood that survival was only partial. Physically, she was free. Psychologically, she remained tethered. The midnight caller had embedded itself in her consciousness, patient, intelligent, and eternal, awaiting her next lapse, the next moment of curiosity, or the next vulnerability. Fear had become inseparable from her reality, a permanent echo of terror that could strike at any time. The apartment, the calls, the shadows, they were all conduits. Rachel had escaped the physical space, but the malevolent presence had found a way to endure through memory, fear, and awareness. She would never be alone, never fully at rest. Its voice remained in the silence, waiting, whispering, always at midnight, always patient, eternal, and unseen.